Good evening. This is Dr. Thomas Klein. I'm coming to you from Raleigh, North Carolina. I'm a specialist in rare painful diseases, which we are now calling permanent rare painful diseases, because all of my 34 patients that I had at one point and all the people that we're talking to on the internet have permanent diseases. That's kind of sad, and people don't want to think they have a permanent disease, but diabetes, hypertension, chronic lung disease, chronic heart disease, these are all pretty much lifelong diseases that can be treated, ameliorated, but basically they're palliative care. Palliative care is when you have a disease you can't get rid of, you take care of the symptoms. If you have ulcerative colitis, you take care of the symptoms of belly cramping and diarrhea. And by the way, opiates are great medicines for that. So at the beginning of each one of our sessions, I want to just bring you up to date on things in the news. This is an article, State Regulators Punish a Doctor for Cutting a Patient's Dose. How about that? Cutting people's medicines off or cutting off their treatments of any kind is negligent care. So New Hampshire has helped us out by finding or getting into trouble with the state regulators. I don't know exactly what happened to them, but this is good news. New Hampshire helping out here. Excuse me, we already talked about that. I need to get organized here. Do you know when the very first federal government intrusion into the practice of medicine occurred? Why has the federal government chosen to interfere with our practice of medicine just concerning opiate drugs? Now, if people want to use the word opioid, I'm asking they stick on a opioid pain medicine. What is the government worried about? It started off, they were worried about sexuality. White women running off with Chinese men. This was an abomination. Randolph Hearst really carried it to the extreme, calling people from Asia the yellow hordes. It was all based on false information. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution that got us into the Vietnam War was based on false information. It's important before making decisions that people sit down and say, gee, Mr. Socrates, do we need to think this through? Do we need to ask questions? What do you mean? White women running off with Asian men. I don't know that Asian men would want to do that. So they don't really sit down and try to figure it out. They just run off and they pass the first law, the federal government. It was called the Opium Exclusion Act. 1909. How many years ago was that? Over 100, right? This began the 100-year crusade that unleashed unprecedented crime, violence, and corruption around the world. A war with no victory in sight even today. It's time that Congress sits down with these federal agencies and with Congress and says, this law Richard Nixon passed in 1970, has it helped? Why are we controlling controlled substances? What are we afraid of? There's no other country in the world that has a licensure requirement like I have or had to prescribe controlled substances. These include, as we mentioned before, medicines for children with hyperactivity, psychiatric medicines like Valium, etc., even some muscle relaxants. So the DEA the federal drug police decide which of these medicines is bad. They've categorized 200. Why are they doing this? Why is the DEA putting pressure on doctors, pharmacists? Because they're told to do it. The police don't make up policy. The police are the soldiers. They do what they're told. Everybody blames the DEA, and that's wrong. We need to blame the people who are their bosses telling them what to do. And who is that? The Department of Justice and the Attorney General and the President and Congress by passing this law for Richard Nixon, which was done for political reasons. We went into that before. But let's not blame the DEA. Let's blame the people in charge of the DEA. So this Opium Exclusion Act started it all off. And then in 1915, there was the Harrison Act, in which the government really became involved with the practice of medicine because they didn't believe doctors like myself should be prescribing opiates to people with addiction disease. We know now that opiate addiction disease or heroin addiction disease is a real disease caused by problems in the brain with the biochemistry, different than the other types of addictions. So in this case, controlling substance is a complete waste of time. If you want to prevent the other kinds of addictions like alcohol, amphetamines, cocaine, yes, you cut down the supply. As a matter of fact, studies after Prohibition, 14 years of no alcohol, did show a reduction in alcohol problems. But it doesn't work for opiates. So in 1909, we got off on the wrong foot. According to the Congressional Research Service at the Library of Congress, highly esteemed people said we have spent $1 trillion on attempting to control drugs in the United States. And what's it got us? Can anybody claim it's cut down on addiction? Overdoses? I heard the other day overdoses skyrocketing again in spite of all these interventions. So we need to get out Mr. Socrates and start asking questions. Congress needs to ask questions one after the other. That's what Socrates does. Here's a little report that, by the way, of that $1 trillion, $600 billion. You know how many big aircraft carriers you could build for that? About 50. It says that the total value of all the drugs sold in the United States is about $64 billion. Why are drugs sold on the streets? Because people with addiction disease can't get them. Only 20% of people with mu receptor addiction disease, our new name for heroin addiction, are being treated because Congress doesn't want them treated. You know why? Because you can't give dope to dopers. So Congress is practicing medicine just like they did in, as I mentioned, the Harrison Act, where they were arresting doctors when we were treating heroin addicts with other opiates. Now we have MAT, medicated assisted treatment, everybody is saying is a good idea, and it is a good idea. But the efficiency of the DEA was rated at 1% of interfering. It's not the DEA's fault. This is what they're told to do. Remember that. That's very important. How did all this really get started? How did doctors get blamed for all this? They're arresting doctors and putting them in prison for prescribing drugs in a way the government doesn't like. People that are supposed to go to prison, like Manuel Noriega, get a 40-year sentence being a huge drug lord. Dr. Joel Smithers, 36 years old with 5 kids, nice guy, had a practice where people took advantage of him. He couldn't recognize the hustlers, so he's in prison for 40 years. Joel Smithers. So here's what the director of the CDC said when they put out their guidelines. Quote, this is Thomas Frieden. Overprescribing opioids, largely for chronic pain, is a key driver of America's drug overdose epidemic. There's no evidence whatsoever that that's true. And that's going to be one of the things we do with the National Pain Council. Our goal is to put out concrete information. People say, well, we don't want to hear your opinion. Well, it's not our opinion. We're going to issue papers where you can look up things yourself. We're not giving opinions. We're giving data that every single person who reads the paper can go check on. This is horrible. What's the matter with this man? Overprescribing opioids for chronic pain? Well, no wonder doctors aren't prescribing them. This was the chief, a physician at the CDC. Key driver. Okay, now everybody knows that the CDC that has not come forth with an explanation where all these deaths are, 40,000, 17,000 they corrected it to, now 60,000. It just bounces all around as a scare number because people believe that overdoses mean addiction, and if you increase overdoses, you're increasing addiction. Not true. More falsehoods. Now it turns out, based on our studies that we're doing at the National Pain Council and also at JATH Educational, which is the research arm of the National Pain Council, it turns out that 95%, where's our little thing here? There it is. 95% of overdoses are multi-drug overdoses. That's more than 2 drugs. Only 3 or 4% are due to opiates only. And that includes heroin as an opioid only. These are the people that get prescriptions and have overdoses for reasons that we're still investigating. This is based on death certificate data, which is a big no-no in research circles. Nobody ever publishes any kind of valid research based on death certificates, since half of them are wrong. Okay? All of these people are deaths in the streets by people with mu receptor addiction disease or heroin addiction disease because they're not getting medical care. That's why they're all dying. How horrible is that? Instead of saying 40,000 people are dying every year because we're not giving them medical care and they have this terrible disease, no, we run around going, get them, lock up those doctors. They're causing this. No, we're not. Now, the U.S. attorneys who are in charge of the DEA, they sent out a letter to prescribers this was Wisconsin. And the letter was sent to 180 patients, which showed their practices were prescribing opioids at a relatively high level compared to other prescribers. You see, high dose gets out there, causes more addiction. So is the U.S. attorney being nasty? No. They're doing what they believe. So one of the jobs of our National Pain Council is to provide educational services for U.S. attorneys, defense attorneys, and judges. They don't know what's going on. They believe that Thomas Frieden doctors are overprescribing and it's causing the overdose epidemic. This is not true. If it were true, reducing the prescriptions should reduce the overdose deaths. The prescriptions have been dropped by almost 20% in the past 5 years, and the overdose deaths are What kind of logic is that? All right, so our topic for the day is the PDMP and APRIS, and it looks like we're running over, so we're going to stop for now, and I'm going to pick this up as a part 2. Thank you.